Hi, this is NCR Davis, and today is Saturday, October 7th, 2023, and this is the second podcast in my series, Growing Your Own Mind. My golden retriever is here at my knees, and she's making, let's see, she's getting comfortable now, so maybe we'll be okay. Before we get started, YouTube allows me to do these podcasts for free. All they ask is that you hit the subscribe button. So please do. Thank you. Last week I shared an excerpt from my novel that has now been released by Casemate Publishers. The book is about a young Allied nurse on the front lines of war-torn France in 1944 and 45. If you haven't listened to that podcast, think about going back to it, because I'm inviting you to give me feedback about that story. Today's true story happened 24 years past World War II. The date was April 4th, 1968. I was 5.5 years old, and my family and I were on a trip, one that, much to my mother's chagrin, was the trip that would change our lives forever. Until 1968, my parents had spent the first 22 years of their marriage raising their family in El Paso, Texas. But my father was from the Mississippi Delta, and when I was 4 years old, he started talking about moving our family to his home state. My mother was hoping that he would drop the idea once he got past what she called his midlife crisis. You see, he decided that he should leave a corporate position in El Paso and return to the Mississippi Delta to open a hardware store in the town he had spent his formative years. He said that he missed his birth family, and he wanted to get away from the corporate life that had him on a plane every few days. I was the youngest of 6 children, and I recall that my dad was always absent for every birthday. On my 4th birthday, he had given me a light bright. You remember those? And in the middle of my birthday party, I remember him calling me from wherever he was traveling that day to wish me a wonderful birthday and wondered if I liked my light bright. Well, I thought it was the greatest present I'd ever received. Hell, I wish I had that light bright today. Wouldn't that be a relic? Anyway, the last year in El Paso was rough. My parents seemed to fight more than they laughed. My mother's arguments seemed sound. She loved her career. She was director of nursing at a wonderful hospital. She and my father had many friends. They were the typical upper middle class family whose kids were in great public schools. From my mother's perspective, why fix perfection? At some point, when we were still in El Paso, I recall that my mother had abandoned her screaming protests, as my father's determination to move us to Mississippi had not been dissuaded in the least. So she had resigned herself to a series of mutterings. I couldn't hear her, but I knew that when she was being sassy, she would roll her eyes and walk away, mumbling. Of course, now I understand that she was probably being passive-aggressive, which might have been one of only a handful of power plays that she felt she could employ. It was the 1960s, after all, and very few women went against their husbands' family decisions. Divorce was almost unheard of. So in the early morning of April 3rd, 1968, our parents packed 4 kids and 2 dogs in a 1967 vanilla Ford Galaxie 500 and headed east. On our way, the plan was to spend the first night somewhere east of Dallas. Then the next day, April 4th, we could head to Memphis and meet my second eldest sister, Mary Ann, who was living in Memphis attending nursing school at Baptist Hospital School of Nursing. We were going to pick up Mary Ann from her dormitory and take her out to dinner that night with the family. Then we would drive on down to the Mississippi Delta that was only about an hour and a half south of Memphis and begin our new existence. My uncle had set us up to live in a 4-bedroom ranch that he owned. It was plopped literally in the middle of sprawling cotton fields. We could live there free of charge until my dad could get his hardware business up and running. Naturally, that was one of the perks my dad continued to stress to my mom. Just think, no mortgage. What a deal. It was the early evening of April 4th, 1968, when we reached the outskirts of Memphis. I was in the middle of the front seat of the Galaxy 500. My dad was driving. My mother was in the passenger seat. And my brother and two of my sisters held the dogs in the back. The dogs were getting antsy, though. They heard the sirens first, I suppose. Something apparently was wrong in Memphis. The city seemed to be in some sort of emergency. My dad turned on the radio, hoping to find out what could be going on. Now, I can imagine that if you're an American and older than 60, you may know exactly what was happening in Memphis, Tennessee on the evening of April 4th, 1968. Allow me, though, to give you some context here before I tell you the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say. I'm sure many of you remember him. My mother had grown up in St. Paul, Minnesota. Her father was civic-minded. He had run hotels and restaurants for most of his career. And he became very involved with the Democratic Party at the time. In fact, long before my birth, my maternal grandparents had become friends with many influential politicians in Minnesota. They entertained Senator Hubert Humphrey in their home many times. When we still lived in El Paso, Humphrey was such a popular senator that he was often on the news. But every time he was on TV, when my father happened to be home, my dad would tell me to run over and turn off the TV. You see, my dad was a staunch Republican, but turning off Senator Humphrey was also a way to tease my mother. He could always get a rise out of her when he told me to run and turn off that damn Democrat, as he would say. Of course, I adored my father and immediately ran to the TV and turned it off to oblige him. Then my mother would give my dad the response he'd been going for. She'd say, "Oh, you, Senator Humphrey has done some wonderful things for this country." And my dad and older siblings loved the entire interaction. They were amused by her melodrama, and she was quite happy to oblige them. But because of that, I realized very early in my life that my parents and family were very much into politics. I remember my mother always joking that her vote was for one thing only, to cancel out my father's vote. And so it went. From a very early age, I knew who was a Republican and who was a Democrat in my family. And from my own parentage all the way to the national stage, I kept up with it. So with that context, I'll get back to the story about that April night in Memphis. My dad turned on the radio. Within seconds, we knew what had happened. Every radio station said the same. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated, shot on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. My father slowed down the Galaxy, looking for a payphone. He said that he better call my sister Mary Ann. There were so many sirens and lights swirling about that the entire Memphis skyline had a blue pallor to it. My brother Roger spotted a payphone on the right side of the vehicle. Daddy pulled over and fumbled in his pocket for some coins. As he was getting out of the car, I remember that he dropped the coins on the floor of the car, and when he dipped his face down, to grab the change, I saw a teardrop from his face onto the floor of the car. I couldn't understand. My daddy was crying. He made the call to my sister. Once they found her and called her to the phone, the call was brief. My dad returned to the car and softly announced that Mary Ann's dorm was on lockdown. She wouldn't be permitted to go to dinner with us. But her supervisor said that we could drop by her dorm building and they would allow her to come downstairs and talk with us for a few minutes at the car window. But absolutely, she would not be able to go to dinner with us that night. Memphis was on edge, to say the least. Riots were expected to break out. As my dad cranked the car for us to meander slowly amid the emergency vehicles toward Pauline Street in downtown Memphis, I said to him, "Daddy, what's wrong? Why are you so upset?" He said, "Oh, baby, a wonderful man died tonight, and I'm just really sad about it." And then I remember exactly how I responded. I'd heard the news. I knew it was Martin Luther King Jr. who had been murdered, but I didn't understand why my father was upset. So I said, "But Daddy, wasn't Martin Luther King a Democrat? I thought you hated Democrats." As you know, children are very literal. Of course, my two sisters and brother in the back seat started chuckling, but my dad didn't. He said, oh no, baby. I don't like some of the Democrats' policies, and I tease your mama about Hubert Humphrey. But Martin Luther King Jr. was a great man. He was helping everyone understand that everybody has a contribution to give to our country, no matter the color of their skin. I wish that we could remember what Martin Luther King Jr. said about what we should consider is the content of a person's character, not the color of a person's skin. After all, I nor you have any control over our skin color. Race is a birth characteristic. All we have control over is how we choose to build the content of our character through our interactions with others, no matter our race nor others' races. This is NCR Davis, and today I've told you a true story that I hope you will think about. Please help me grow my own mind with your memories and thoughts. Write to me about a significant childhood memory from your own life that's tied to maybe a significant societal event. Visit my website, Grow Your Mind, with ncrdavis.com, or email me. My address is forthegirls@growyourmind with ncrdavis.com. Again, it's just all one word, forthegirls@growyourmind with ncrdavis.com. And if you're interested in my book, you can buy it wherever you like to buy books. Thanks so much for listening.